Hello, my name is Nathan Vanette from Growing Green Family Farms. We're located in upstate South Carolina with three unique farm locations, one in Travelers Rest, one in downtown Greenville, and one in Anderson, South Carolina. So today we have the exciting topic of bugs to discuss, in particular, how can we manage pests? So let me get started with our slideshow today, and we'll take you on a journey just to try to learn more about bugs, but then more importantly, how can we manage the pests themselves? So, integrated pest management. This is an intriguing topic just in terms of what can we do in our systems around our farms to manage pests while creating a symbiotic relationship in the ecosystem for best handling and both beneficial insects and pollinators. At Growing Green Family Farms, we are 100% spray free, so we don't use any pesticides or herbicides, which is quite challenging, as I'm sure you are familiar with all of the bugs that we have here in the Carolinas. Especially as temperatures have been warming up, we've been noticing more different types of pests migrating from the south, especially Georgia and even Florida, which continues to contribute to the pressures that we have on our farms. And ultimately, as we grow, it's very challenging to have to think about, oh no, there's another bug coming into another crop. For instance, right now we just planted collard greens, and it's quite hard because we have those cabbage loopers, the moths that just lay their eggs, and they are almost like dive bombers, literally dropping eggs on every single plant. This makes it very challenging to get a crop that we can then take to market. So today we're going to just venture into different types of pest management systems. So, what is integrative pest management? Essentially, this is a system or a plan that is developed on a farm to try to combat natural pests that are in the ecosystem. A good example would be aphids, for instance, which hits a lot of the greens coming up in fall and winter. Just creating a plan, if you start to see them in your environment, how do you identify them? How do you find a solution and implement that solution in a timely fashion to prevent any population explosion with that particular pest? In terms of integrated pest management, this is frequently done in the absence of pesticides. There are certain applications in which it is utilized within the system, but our goal is to go pesticide free with this, which is challenging. So you might ask, does this work? It's very challenging to be able to evaluate this, especially up front. For this type of a pest system, takes time to implement. It can be easy to think that you're going to just change the way you grow or the environment and to expect the same differences or better differences the next day. But this isn't always the case. For example, on our farm at Growing Green Family Farms, we've had to implement a multi step procedure, which has taken 2 years to get into place now. But as a result, we have noticed that our pest numbers have greatly reduced while our beneficial insects are off the charts, which is quite exciting. It is a lot of work, but we're hoping that in the long run, it'll just continue to create an ecosystem that is more balanced, but more importantly, will outlive ourselves and our farm. So, might this help you? Well, we'll go through a couple of things today just to see if it does, in particular with your pest applications. For one thing to keep in mind is the locality of insects. There are some insects that migrate over a large area. In particular, these are the ones that fly, but you can have localized pest pressure, which can be more challenging to try to counteract, especially since a neighboring farm might not have any issues, or your local extension service might not have information on how to properly combat that particular insect. We have been very excited to be able to participate with the University of Georgia in Athens on some collaborative research. In particular, they have been coming to our different farm locations to both collect information on the quantity of bugs that we have, both the herbivores and the predators, but then also the environment that they are grown in. For there are different impacting things that can either positively or negatively impact both your herbivores and your predators. So here you can see the graphs. We'll start with the one on the left pertaining to your herbivores. The averages are collected from, I believe it's around 50 or 55 local farms in the Georgia, upstate Georgia, South Carolina, and southern western North Carolina regions. So amongst the 50, you can see the averages, just the number of herbivores that they collect. The way they collect these bugs is they actually have large vacuums. It almost looks like a a leaf blower, but instead of blowing, it sucks them in. This enables them to go over particular areas. In particular, they were uh, sampling cucurbits and tomatoes in particular. And that was fascinating because they were just trying to analyze what type of bugs are there on these crops. We have some data sheets which I will share and link to at the end of the presentation here so that you can figure out what bugs in particular are attacking these crops in our region. Collaborating with this is they're trying to figure out, does soil fertility or weed management impact these types of pests or predators positively or negatively. So as you progress to the right part of that graph, you can see that GG Anderson, that is our Anderson farm, our numbers were much lower in terms of the number of herbivores that we had on our farm. And likewise, at our Greenville location, we almost had absolutely no pests on our tomatoes. The yellow bar would be for our cucurbits, which would be some different summer squash that we had. And we surprisingly didn't have many squash vine borers, but we did have a lot of the Mexican bean beetles and a couple of the pickle worms as well. But on the graph to the right, this is the number of predators. So this would be the type of predators that you have in your ecosystem that might be able to prey on those particular herbivores that are affecting those crops. So you can see the averages there. We didn't have a lot of pests that were, or the herbivores that were attacking those particular crops. So like in Anderson, our numbers were low. But at GG Greenville, you saw these numbers were off the charts. One interesting thing to note pertaining to both the data points here, we did not bring in any beneficial insects, which is oftentimes a pivotal point on your integrated pest management system. For instance, you can bring in lacewings, you could bring in ladybugs, or even praying mantises. And there's a number of different types of bugs, or even nematodes, that you can implement into your environment just to help combat your herbivores. We've been starting to take the approach of less is more in terms of the disturbance that we have on the ecosystem, which is challenging because farming in its nature is trying to change your ecosystem to grow a productive crop. And these crops aren't always native, which is where we oftentimes run into different pest pressures. So here's some more information. Weed coverage is one of the data points that UGA is trying to correlate to see if it positively or negatively impacts both of those pest and predator numbers. So as you can see, our weed pressure was pretty high, but one thing that this chart in particular does not know is the weed cover that they take into consideration is any leaf coverage on the soil. In our high tunnels, we did not use any landscape fabric as we were experimenting with different forms of intercropping in particular. For example, in the center of our greenhouse, we have sorrel, which is a vibrant, lemony, zesty green. And then we also intercropped some radishes as well as uh, lettuces amongst the tomatoes. So a lot of our ground coverage, which is represented here as weeds, was actually a viable crop for continuing to bring to market. What's great about this is you're utilizing different canopy levels of your growing system, which helps shade your growing, in particular the soil, which then helps present the opportunity to boost your soil moisture retention levels, as well as improve fertility as a whole. So most of those numbers, not to say that we're weed free, but a lot of that was prevalent due to the fact that we were intercropping. So here they were also analyzing soil pH and macronutrients in particular, and some micronutrients, just to see, okay, what were those numbers, and might that be a correlation to your beneficial or your pest pressure? This is something that they're continuing to analyze, and for this reason, they're counting as many data points as possible. And so they'll come on the farm, do a soil sample, analyze the weed coverage, and cross-evaluate these numbers as much as possible, just to see if there anything that is similar pertaining from one farm to another. For example, if our potassium or magnesium is too high, is that negatively or positively impacting either of the situations? With the pests or the beneficial insects. Ideally, your fertility is going to be fairly equal, but you can see that ours is variable. Part of the reason is the growing practices on these two farms that are represented are slightly different in terms of how they got started. For example, at Greenville, we have 8 inches of beautiful compost. So those numbers are going to be a little bit more elevated, in particular with phosphorus, just because there's so much organic matter. And at Anderson, our growing practices have been using a lot of the native clay, which presents a little bit more of the magnesium and more elevated nitrogen, in particular because we've been creating our own composting system on site. So why not pesticides? I know for years, I remember growing up, my grandfather would use 7 dust on his different crops, tomatoes in particular, to take care of the tomato hornworm. It can seem like an easy fix for a pesky solution or pesky issue that we have on our farms. But one thing that I've noticed is it affects certain things that we can't necessarily see with our eyes. For instance, microorganisms in the soil. We haven't really been able to analyze or collect that type of data on a large scale, even in different research institutes. It has been encouraging to see that research is now being conducted on this behalf, just to see what are we doing to the soil microorganisms, in particular different types of bacteria or fungi, with pesticide applications. For pesticides, do depending on what ones you are using, have some residual effect. And when that gets into the soil, you're dealing with microorganisms that might be a lot more sensitive than the macrobugs that we actually see. In addition to that, it can hamper nematodes. Now, that could be the negative nematodes, such as if you have root nematodes getting into your potatoes or carrots. But more from where we're looking at it is your beneficial nematodes, which can help break the pest cycle of different pests, in particular your beetles. Uh, if you are using pesticides, some of that residual effect can have a negative effect on nematodes. Once again, this data is hard to collect and quantify as there are so many free radicals that are introducing into the system. But in terms of just considering pesticides, that might be something good to analyze. So if that is something you're going towards with your crop system, it might be good just to do a control where you're not doing any sprays next to wherever or whatever sprays that you want to try to use. Lastly, well, two more things. It can also harm beneficial insects and pollinators. So, beneficial insects, not all of them have a hard exoskeleton like your ladybugs, but some of them, like your lacewings, can be a little bit more delicate. And this can be challenging because pesticides do not necessarily dictate what is a bad bug or a good bug. There are certain ones of which cover the surface of the leaf, so then it only affects the bugs that are biting into the leaf itself. BT is frequently used. But the negative side is we don't fully understand pertaining to the potential impact it could have on the reproduction systems of beneficial insects with them just being in that environment and inhaling that particular spray. And lastly, it can actually cause increased pest pressure. This may seem almost counterintuitive with a pesticide, but essentially what a pesticide is doing is you're removing bugs, sometimes both the good bugs and the bad bugs, from an environment. When you do this, let's say it just removes the bad bugs. Your good bugs, let's say in this equation, let's do ladybugs with aphids. If you remove all of your aphids that are in your environment, the ladybugs will no longer have a food source. So your ladybugs will end up going away. As a result, if you end up having any aphids come back to the environment, they'll be able to reproduce much quicker than if you didn't or impact the ecosystem with that spray. As a result, you can have pest explosions of the population, which can easily get out of control and then make oftentimes many pesticides much harder to utilize as part of your integrated pest management system. This isn't always the case, and there are some biosprays, more natural, that you can utilize. But on our farm, we have been just trying to go completely spray free, which has been a challenging journey, especially the first 2 or 3 years where you're dealing with all of the natural herbaceous pests in particular, and there isn't necessarily any easy way to get rid of these. I mean, we've resorted with harlequin beetles and your caterpillars, for instance, just hand picking them. Even though spray would be a lot more time effective, we're hoping in the long run this will just continue to balance our ecosystem to just really offer that habitat to attract those beneficial insects and pollinators while balancing out your pests naturally. So, beneficial insects and animals. This is oftentimes a key to trying to balance your integrated pest management system. In particular, if you are growing in high tunnels or a greenhouse, this is areas where it is protected from rainfall, which rainfall is actually part of the pest management system, of just letting that rain disturb any of your pest eggs in particular. But in a greenhouse where it's an ideal growing condition, you're protecting the plants and the ecosystem from temperature extremes frequently. You're essentially creating an environment where bugs absolutely thrive. So this is also an area where introducing beneficial insects just to naturally balance that ecosystem, or animals, as you can see with the frogs, can help with this. One thing to note is it's good to be selective about what type of bugs you are buying to implement into your system, and make sure that you have a food source for them. Otherwise, those bugs will not be effective at attacking your particular pest pressure. When it comes to beneficial insects, the best offense is a good defense. That's the philosophy I like to approach it with. For this reason, nematodes are a great one to get started with. For example, if you know that you have a particular area where you have the yellow margin leaf beetle or flea beetles in particular, the nematodes, if you get them implemented into your soil structure in particular, it can actually interrupt their reproductive cycle by attacking the grubs in their larva state in the soil. If you can take them out when they're in the soil before they hatch into the adult form in this equation, where the adults are the ones that do the damage to, such as your turnips or your leafy greens, that is the best case scenario. For then you have been able to basically knock out two birds with one stone, because by preventing the insect from getting to its adult phase, you've also prevented that pest in your area from reproducing to then continue to perpetuate your pest issue. One of my favorite things to do is actually trying to attract native species. For once again, you can purchase and bring in beneficial insects, but this is another input that we are having on an ecosystem to be mindful of. For we can think that bringing in beneficial insects is a good way to go, or animals, but the downside is if you do too much of one thing, it can have a negative impact and create a hole in the food chain for other native species that you might have had already, thus creating more of a monoculture in terms of what type of insects you have in your ecosystem, which the fewer moving parts there are in an ecosystem, the more fragile it is, and the quicker things can go wrong. For instance, if you introduce a bunch of ladybugs, your lacewings might not have the food source it needs for reproducing. When this happens, let's say you had a particular type of bug that was preying on your ladybugs, or your ladybugs ran out of food because they don't have, or they are more selective with what they eat. Well, they'll leave the environment, and because you don't have the lacewings, which might also feed on your thrips or other insects, you have lost part of your backbone to your ecosystem. So just be mindful of purchasing them. For any input we have can have beneficial but also negative consequences. And frequently, it is hard to quantify or analyze what type of impact it has until it is too late. With native species, part of this is creating an environment for them to attract them. My favorite one is actually lacewings or praying mantises. These need more stable plants in particular, where they can lay their egg sacs and reside during the day and then move out into your crop gardens. A good example that we do on our farm is actually marigolds or rosemary. We try to have that around the perimeter. And a lot of your fresh herbs, such as oregano or thyme, that are more perennial in nature, if you plant them around your perimeter, you'll find a lot of those beneficial insects to reside there. And then they'll go into your crop gardens where you have more of your annual crops to naturally balance your pest pressure. This can be challenging because all of a sudden you're introducing another crop or another plant into your system, and it can disrupt the efficiency of flow of monocropping, which is frequently utilized in market garden systems. For example, if you have a bed of arugula, it's challenging to have time next to the arugula because if you're going through with your greens harvester, you might accidentally harvest some of that. And I don't know about you, but thyme and arugula don't necessarily always go well together, especially in a fresh salad. So creating a border, and for what we did was actually having a buffer between our beneficial or plants that we were planting and our crop garden. And we put in between there some mulch, just wood chips that we got from a local arborist. What this did is it enabled us to balance that tension of creating an environment that attracts them while also managing the efficiencies that we desire in a market garden. What you do to the soil, for example, covering it, can also be part of attracting or detracting from the environment. We like wood chips as it can be challenging, I will say, because you have to balance your carbon and nitrogen in terms of the fertility of the soil. But the type of microorganisms that it attracts, in particular earthworms, just for the aeration of the soil, has been spectacular to just continue to evaluate how much better the crops do around areas that we have wood chips on the paths. In some cases, like with our basil harvest this year, we had 30% higher harvest and yields in the beds that had wood chip mulches around them. This is subject to be different depending on your environment or how your nitrogen levels are. For if you don't have enough nitrogen, the carbon level of the wood chips can pull from that. The potential downside of wood chips is it can harbor some pests. We have not had any issues with this. I've heard that some people have issues with roly-polies or slugs, for instance, that harbor underneath the wood chips during the day and attack your crops at night. Uh, we've been curious about this and continue to analyze to see if there's something else in the ecosystem. For we haven't used any pesticides on our environment, but there's something about those wood chips that we think has been enhancing the environment, just in terms of balancing your pest and predator situations. So, how can you possibly implement this on your farm? This can be daunting, especially since we're talking if you're currently using pesticides and want to get away from it for your integrated pest management system. There are a lot of hurdles that you have to potentially cover. The area I like to start with is having a clean perimeter. Can be very challenging at a farm because mowing or maintaining your perimeter, that isn't where your cash crops are. But what we have found is if you have grasses or shrubs that are propagating close to your environment, it's frequently a place where pests can harbor, reproduce, and then come into your annual garden area. So having a clean perimeter is one area that we have found to be very helpful. And you could actually utilize this perimeter for planting beneficial flowers, for instance, to attract your pollinators, or maybe a different type of hedgerow to attract some of your beneficial insects. We've experimented with hibiscus, which didn't necessarily attract, but it was a pretty perimeter that didn't attract a lot of pests. But we have found, once again, your common herbs to be excellent for this area. For the last thing we want to do is add more mowing or weed trimming to our tasks around the farm, as that is one area of input that doesn't necessarily have a direct correlation to value output. However, if you do so, it may, from the stance that it's balancing your bug and pest pressure, for the fewer inputs that we have on our farms pertaining to sprays, it means it's one less time that you have to walk up and down those roads. So if we can eliminate that, it has the potential of creating a profitable environment that might just help save you time, but then also money. Feeding the soil. As we were looking back at the data that UGA collected, they are thinking that there is a direct correlation between your soil fertility and your pest situations. Uh, the longer we have analyzed, especially as we've progressed towards a no-till options on our farm, we have been seeing this to be the case. For instance, if you have good fertility, excellent porosity, balancing the chemistry of the soil with the physics of the soil, it's incredible just to see the type of bioactivity that almost just blooms and blossoms forth, both in terms of the macro level, what you can see with your eyes, but more importantly, the microorganisms that we can't see. Uh, by having the food sources for them in the environment, it has a better chance of retaining, especially those beneficial microorganisms that help balance your system. Another area that feeding the soil is important is bugs have an uncanny ability to spot and locate the plants that have potential nutrient deficiencies. One way they do this is when a plant is stressed, it actually sends out chemical compounds that certain bugs can pick up and translate into information that, hey, this is food. So if you have a very healthy crop and then a couple of plants that are not doing well, it might be best to either just pull those plants out to potentially disrupt that signal that those plants might be emitting, or just continue to work on the feeding of your soil. Both of these situations I have found to be very important for integrated pest management systems, as essentially what we're feeding the soil will feed our plants. And the healthier our plants are, the fewer pests we're likely to have. This isn't always the case, but there has been some interesting information and data collected that different universities are starting to analyze, in particular on sugar levels. So they'll take the Brix meter and analyze different sugar levels of different plants. And if you're usually over 8 or 10, they have been finding that there are far fewer pests on those plants than if they're in the 4 to 6 range. Once again, this is an interesting data point of which we're hoping to start being able to collect and analyze on on our farm for any time that you can collect data. Yes, it's taking time, but hopefully it will continue to enable us to create an ecosystem that is not only producing a healthier plant, but also a healthier environment. That way, this farm and the farms that we are starting to create around here can not only be productive, but be more self sustainable. So, some crop examples pertaining to, like, if you want to attract or detract pests. That's one interesting one is how do you detract pests? We have found that, for instance, planting your garlic by your lettuce will help detract both your large pests, such as rabbits and deer, because they don't like that pungent aroma. But for us, it seems to be more of the insects, in particular aphids, that do not like that aroma. Onions do great with cabbage because cabbage is naturally a pungent crop in terms of the aroma, and the chemical signal is almost like a beacon, just waving at the white moths to come down and lay their eggs for the caterpillars. So it doesn't always work, and we've been trying to figure out the proper way to, the proper ratio of how many alliums to how many cabbages. But we've just been building it into our crop rotation in terms of always having rather than a whole field of just cabbage. Maybe having a row of cabbage next to a row of onions, next to a row of lettuces. This does a couple of things. It not only helps with your soil fertility, but it's also diversifying what type of microorganisms are in the soil. For if you just have one crop, it's going to attract particular type of fungi that are specialized for that particular crop. This can cause issues when you're trying to go with your crop rotation from one crop to another crop because there might not be the right bacteria or fungi in the soil to balance that, which then can impact the fertility of your soil for that particular plant or the availability of nutrients. So, just by intercropping, we've found that it not only helps detract the pests, but it also has the potential of attracting beneficial insects, as well as just adding to the diversity of your soil microbe levels. Pertaining to attracting bugs, our favorite way to do that is actually with flowers. For that not only attracts your pollinators, but it can also attract the praying mantises, the lacewings, the ladybugs, and spiders, as you see in this picture here. Uh, Marigolds have been very successful for us, or we'll go ahead and plant some lavender, something that's aromatic that might detract but also attract at the same time. Companion planting can also be a pivotal tool pertaining to what crops can help each other with the soil fertility, but then also the detraction or attraction. This is also called pushing or pulling, depending on if you want to attract pests to a particular area with a trap crop. For example, if you do turnips, in the case of yellow margin leaf beetles, turnips are like their candy. So you could plant a row of turnips, attract all the pests that you can over there, while you have your other cash crops planted elsewhere, which hopefully will not be impacted as much. It also concentrates those bugs in this type of situation, which then enables you to eradicate those pests. Oftentimes, we'll just use a flame weeder, or if you're trying to also utilize or save the, let's say in the case of the turnips, the bulbs, go ahead and just vacuum them up or find a way to collect them and eradicate them from the environment. No-till options. This can be challenging because tilling has made it easy just in terms of or trying to prevent compaction and implement and incorporate different types of nutrients. The challenging thing with this is it does directly impact some of the different notes I've mentioned in feeding the soil, in particular your mycorrhizas and your different types of bacteria. In a soil levels, You have certain bacteria that are aerobic, needing oxygen, which will be towards the top of the soil, and anaerobic bacteria, which are further down. These bacteria are important for the uh, availability of nutrients, which helps keep your plants healthier. And the challenging thing is if you till, it flips the anaerobic ones up to the surface, which ends up killing the bacteria, and the aerobic ones are implemented down into the ground. What this has the potential of doing is creating a more sterile environment in your soils conditions, which can enable particular pests, such as your flea beetle or yellow margin leaf beetle, the larva to thrive very well in those soil conditions. This can be challenging because, once again, you can't necessarily analyze those pests with the naked eye, but you will certainly notice it when those bugs start to emerge. So we have found we're now a year and a half of going completely no-till on one of our farms in Greenville, and have noticed the biodiversity of our beneficial insects to go off the charts. Well, the type of pests that we have greatly diminish. In addition to this, we've also noticed that the soil structure has greatly improved. Our moisture retention is much, much higher. So during the summer, we don't have to irrigate nearly as long. And in addition to that, it has created an environment which has greatly impacted positively our crops. We're getting, for instance, our radishes and turnips from when we seed to harvest, almost perfect harvest and yields every time, as long as we're careful with the physics and the chemistry of the soil, each and every time we plant them. So, pertaining to this, it can make it challenging with how do you get your nutrients in. We have found that just by top dressing with compost, and if you need any other types of fertilizers, to put that underneath your compost, to be a good system, it does two things. As long as your compost was brought up to temperature to kill your weed seed, it fixes a lot of your weed management issues, which weeds are one particular element that can negatively impact your beneficial insects while attracting more pests. So we've essentially been able to, once again, hit two things with one stone. Uh, Increase the fertility of our soil and the benefits it has to our soil structure, while at the same time, it has nearly eliminated all of our weeds on our farms. Row covers are excellent for particular crops. For example, there are certain crops that it seems like regardless of what you do, you always have some sort of pest that attacks it. For us, this is our summer squash. I don't know what your experience is around the Carolinas or wherever you may be tuning in from, but summer squash seem to be attracting nearly every bug and devastating bugs, such as the vine borer, the pickleworm, Mexican bean beetles, and the list goes on. If you do row covers, the challenging thing is a lot of the summer squashes do need to be pollinated. So what we'll do is we'll cover them at night. For example, with the vine borer, that is a nocturnal moth that lays that larva down by the base of the stem. So if you cover those plants with a row cover, oftentimes it's like a fine mesh. It prevents the moth from being able to get in amongst your plants. And then during the daytime when your pollinators are out, simply remove those covers. It enables them to pollinate your crops and effectively increase your production. The challenging thing with row covers is management. How do you keep them clean? Especially since if you're putting it over a crop that has a potential of being disease ridden, if you don't sterilize it, it could spread that disease onto further crops, especially if you're using it from one summer squash crop to another. What we have found is just having almost like a dip solution, because the insect netting is oftentimes fairly strong and can handle some moisture dunking. So we'll just put some Sanidate or something to sanitize it, dunk the fabric, let it air dry, and then go ahead and store for your next crop. Row covers are also excellent for if you have leafy greens that might be attacked by larger pests, for instance, rabbits or groundhogs. For example, our farm up in Traveler's Rest, we have quite a groundhog issue. And even the greens that we have planted in our high tunnels are constantly being marauded by those groundhogs. By keeping them covered with a row cover, it isn't necessarily bulletproof, but it definitely helps deter them, especially if you can weigh it down in such a way to prevent them from getting up and under. Uh, it also, with your leafy greens, helps prevent aphids. The challenging thing is if you do have aphids already underneath your row covers, then you are increasing the environment or environmental situation where they thrive, because you're then preventing your beneficial insects from going under. For this reason, it's important, if you're using row covers, or even if you're not using row covers in your high tunnels or low tunnels or outside, to monitor your pests. This can be challenging, as where do you begin? We love to do yellow sticky cards. The challenging thing is they can get different types of pollinators to get stuck to them because it's the color yellow, which is frequently the color of the blossoms that our pollinators are going for. So make sure that if you're using those cards, to position them in such an area where it has minimal impact on your pollinators. For example, we use these in our high tunnels for aphid and thrip monitoring. We'll try to position it as close to the ground as possible and away from any blooming plants. So if we have a bed of lettuce next to tomatoes, we'll get it as close to the lettuce as possible and as far away from the tomatoes as possible, so as not to attract those pollinators. It doesn't always work, but the more we can do to try to positively impact your beneficial pollinators and negatively impact your predators, the better. So, resources. In terms of what you do with your integrated pest management system, there's a lot of good information online. I found our local extension office to be very helpful, but almost more importantly is talking to your fellow local farmers. It's been amazing here in upstate South Carolina to almost have like a collaborative effort of just talking with the farmers around the area for a couple of reasons. If you have migrating pests, for instance, and you have someone who has a farm to your south or whatever direction those pests are coming in from, they might be able to spot that pest and let you know, as long as you're staying in touch with them before it affects your farm. This was greatly beneficial for us a couple of years back when we had a really bad infestation of armyworms. It affected a lot of northern Georgia and all the way up into Anderson County. And it was amazing just watching those armyworms go from the south and wipe out. They don't really segregate one crop from another, but they just mowed nearly everything down. But because we were given some notice from some farmers to the south from us, where they were migrating from, we were able to do what we can to try to prevent the type of damage that they might have on our crops. For example, for us, this was putting down some diatomaceous earth, as these were basically just crawling on the ground. They are moths that lay them. But what we ended up having is they just came from the field across the street and just kept on moving towards the north. That diatomaceous earth they did not like too much, and we were able to save a lot of our farm areas. They did get into the pasture and wipe out the grasses, but it greatly positively impacted our crops by deterring them from that area. So, creating a network with your local farms has been incredible. Another tool that we have found to be invaluable is reach out to your nearby ag university. There are some very helpful entomologists, people who study insects for a living, who might be able to help you analyze one particular pest that you might be having an issue with. We found this very helpful with University of Georgia in Athens in particular, especially as we continue to collaborate with research collaboratives. And we're hoping that by working with ag universities, yes, it takes time, but in order to properly collect data, you need people who have those skill sets and have the ability to do it in a peer reviewed research setting. As when we're able to do it in this fashion, rather than it just being verbally or I had great success with this, we can then actually collaborate and produce data that hopefully will positively impact the agricultural region for the next generations to come. This is really one area in which has actually started to impact growing green family farms and our mission, and as a result, affect our vision and our values. The core value has been to stay pesticide and herbicide free. And for that reason, we found that collaborating with the ag universities to be pivotal, because we want this to be something that branches out beyond just what we're doing, but try to inspire as many people around our region. For growing without pesticides or herbicides can be done. It takes a lot of work, but we have found that it results in a beautiful, beautiful farm. For example, keeping that perimeter clean, having your rows nicely oriented with your benefit or attracting the beneficial insects. Uh, when you take a step back and look at the hard work that you put in, it is so rewarding just to be able to see the beauty that can happen, as well as the great diversity. Uh, it is just a wonder to be able to walk through our gardens and be able to count, 20, 30 different types of bugs just in one row. And this is, I think, part of the future of trying to not only preserve our farms and our farmland, but also preserve the insect species, creating a biodiverse environment that not only positively impacts our farms, but more importantly, the ecosystem at large. For these are different components that can have the possibility of outlasting us, preserving pollinators. For pollinators are continuing to be uh, marginalized greatly with pesticide use, and that's been sad to see, especially since pollinators are very pivotal to our food sources. Well, thank you for joining me today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can go to our website at growinggreenfamilyfarms.com or email me at growinggreenfamilyfarm@gmail.com. Well, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Uh, Biggest thing I can say is get out there, experiment. There are so many different areas of which you can collect your own data for your own farm. But don't be afraid to share it with others, for that's the joy, once again, of collaborating with other farmers, is just being able to see what others are doing, encourage each other, and have fun while you're doing it. Well, we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for joining me today.